The autumn of 1868 brought more than falling leaves to the Colorado Territory. It brought a silence so deep that even the wind seemed afraid to disturb it. The Double Eagle Ranch sprawled across the valley like a monument to dreams that had died, with the men who built them. Samuel Harrison stood on his porch, watching the sun set behind mountains that had once echoed with the laughter of 5 sons. Now they echoed only with ghosts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light crept through the windows of the Double Eagle Ranch house like an unwelcome visitor, illuminating rooms that had grown too large for one man's footsteps. Samuel Harrison sat at the head of a dining table built for 7, staring at 6 empty chairs that might as well have been tombstones. The coffee in his cup had long since grown cold, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Time had become meaningless. When there was no one left to share it with. At 62, Samuel's hands still bore the calluses of a man who'd built an empire from nothing. His weathered face told the story of 40 years spent taming wild land, fighting drought and flood, turning a patch of Colorado wilderness into the most prosperous cattle ranch in 3 counties. But those same hands now shook slightly as he held the telegram that had arrived 3 months ago. Its words burned into his memory like a brand. Regret to inform you. Sergeant Thomas Harrison, killed in action at Washita River, November 27, 1868. Thomas had been the last. The final name on a list that no father should ever have to keep. First had been Michael, his eldest, cut down at Antietam in 62. Then came David and Joseph, twins who died within hours of each other at Gettysburg. Robert had fallen at Cold Harbor, and James, sweet, laughing James, had taken a Confederate bullet at Spotsylvania. Each death had carved away another piece of Samuel's heart until only Thomas remained, serving with Custer's 7th Cavalry, writing letters filled with dreams of coming home to help run the ranch. Now Thomas was gone too, and Samuel was left with nothing but memories and the silence that pressed against his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. The ranch still functioned, barely. Samuel's foreman, Bill Crawford, and the remaining hands kept the cattle fed and the fences mended, but there was no joy in the work anymore. No future being built, just the mechanical motions of men going through familiar routines while their boss sat on his porch and stared at nothing. The hands whispered among themselves when they thought Samuel couldn't hear, talking about selling out, moving on, finding work with ranchers who still cared about tomorrow. Samuel couldn't blame them. He'd stopped caring about tomorrow the day that telegram arrived. The letters from his sons were locked in a wooden chest in his bedroom. 5 thick bundles tied with string, chronicling dreams that would never be fulfilled. Michael had planned to expand into horse breeding. The twins had talked about opening a mercantile in town. Robert wanted to study law, and James had his heart set on building a school for the children of ranch families scattered across the territory. Thomas, the youngest, had simply wanted to come home and learn everything his father could teach him about running cattle. All of it, gone. Reduced to ink on paper and memories that grew more painful with each passing day. The Double Eagle had been more than a ranch. It had been a legacy. Samuel had carved it from raw wilderness with the absolute certainty that his sons would carry it forward, that their children and grandchildren would walk these same trails and work this same land. He'd built not just for himself, but for generations. Yet unborn, now the very success of his efforts mocked him. What was the point of owning 10,000 acres when there was no one to inherit them? What meaning did prosperity have when it would die with him? The townspeople of Cedar Falls had tried to help in their awkward, well-meaning way. Pastor Williams stopped by weekly with casseroles and clumsy attempts at comfort. The banker, Howard Phillips, had suggested investments that might provide income without requiring personal attention. Even Martha Stevens, the widow who ran the general store, had hinted that companionship might ease his burden. But Samuel wanted none of it. Comfort felt like betrayal of his son's memory, and the thought of starting over at his age seemed impossible. He'd begun drinking more than he should, whiskey becoming the only thing that could blur the sharp edges of his grief. The bottle sat on the table beside his chair most evenings now, its amber contents providing temporary escape from the weight of empty rooms and broken dreams. Bill Crawford had started watching him with worried eyes, the kind of careful attention given to a man who might be losing his grip on sanity. Maybe he was. Samuel had caught himself talking to his son sometimes, addressing empty chairs as if Michael might answer from his place at the table, or calling out instructions to Thomas before remembering that his youngest boy was buried in a military cemetery 1,000 miles away. The ranch hands had probably heard him and added it to their growing list of concerns about their employer's state of mind. The daily routines that had once brought satisfaction now felt like elaborate performances staged for an audience that no longer existed. He still rose before dawn, still walked the property lines, still checked on the cattle and reviewed the books. But it was all mechanical, empty motion without purpose or passion. He was a man going through the motions of living while his soul remained buried with his boys. The worst moments came at sunset, when the day's work was done and the hands had retired to the bunkhouse. That was when the silence became absolute, when the house seemed to echo with all the conversations that would never happen, all the laughter that would never ring through these halls again. Samuel would sit on his porch, watching the light fade from the sky, and wonder how much longer he could endure this hollow existence. Letters from distant relatives suggested he sell the ranch and move back east, where family could look after him in his declining years. The very thought made him sick. This land held every memory of his boys, every trace of the life they'd built together. Leaving would be the final betrayal, the ultimate admission that everything they'd worked for had been meaningless. But staying was becoming unbearable too. The ranch required constant attention, decisions that affected dozens of employees and thousands of head of cattle. Samuel found it increasingly difficult to focus on problems that seemed trivial compared to the magnitude of his loss. Why should he care about market prices for beef when his sons would never see the profits? What did it matter if the north pasture needed new fencing when there was no one to carry on the work? The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his situation. The Double Eagle was located 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, a distance that had once felt like perfect solitude for a man raising a family. Now it felt like exile. Days passed without meaningful human contact, just brief exchanges with ranch hands who treated him with the careful respect reserved for broken things. That might shatter if handled too roughly. The changing seasons marked time in ways that felt both eternal and meaningless. Winter was approaching, bringing with it the annual challenges of keeping livestock fed and watered through months of snow and bitter cold. In previous years, winter planning had been a family affair, with each son taking responsibility for different aspects of the operation. This year, Samuel faced the prospect of his first winter alone, and the thought filled him with a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. He'd begun to understand why some men simply gave up when faced with losses too great to bear. The idea of walking away, of leaving everything behind and disappearing into the vastness of the American frontier, held an appeal that surprised him with its intensity. He could sell the ranch, take whatever money remained after settling debts, and vanish into the territories where a man could lose himself completely. But even that escape felt impossible. Where could he go that wouldn't remind him of dreams shared with sons who would never see them fulfilled? How could he start over when every sunset reminded him of evenings spent planning futures that would never arrive? The ranch had become both his prison and his sanctuary, the only place on earth that still held traces of the family he'd lost. As November deepened into December, Samuel found himself spending more time in the small cemetery on the hill behind the house, where his wife Mary lay buried beneath a simple granite stone. She'd died giving birth to Thomas, 23 years ago, and Samuel had promised her grave that he'd raise their boys to be men she could be proud of. He'd kept that promise, only to watch all 5 of them march off to war with heads held high and hearts full of duty. The conversations he held with Mary's grave had become his primary form of human interaction, pathetic though it seemed. He told her about the latest letters from the boys, forgetting sometimes that those letters had stopped coming months ago. He shared his fears about the ranch's future, his growing certainty that everything they'd built together would die with him. Sometimes he wept openly, something he'd never done in front of the living, letting grief pour out of him like water. From a broken down dot, it was during one of these graveyard visits that Samuel first noticed the smoke. Thin columns rising from the valley beyond the eastern ridge, too regular and too numerous to be natural fires. Someone was camping there, multiple families by the look of it, and they'd been there for several days. In his current state of mind, Samuel's first instinct was to ignore it entirely. Let whoever it was pass through without interference. He had no energy for dealing with strangers and their problems, but as the days passed and the smoke continued, practical concerns began to override his desire for isolation. The land where the strangers were camped belonged to the Double Eagle, and winter was approaching fast. If they were travelers, they needed to move on before snow made travel impossible. If they were squatters, they needed to be warned off before they established any claim to his property. Either way, the situation required his attention, whether he wanted to give it or not. The prospect of human interaction filled Samuel with a mixture of dread and something that might have been relief. For months he'd existed in a bubble of grief and solitude, insulated from the world beyond his ranch boundaries. Perhaps it was time to remember that other people existed, that life continued beyond the borders of his personal tragedy. At the very least, dealing with trespassers would provide a temporary distraction from the weight of empty rooms and broken dreams. As he prepared to ride out and investigate the mysterious camp, Samuel caught sight of himself in the hall mirror and was shocked by what he saw. The man staring back at him looked far older than 62, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to focus on the present. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and his beard had grown wild and unkempt. He looked like exactly what he was, a broken man barely holding himself together. The realization should have motivated him to clean himself up, to present himself as the successful rancher he'd once been. Instead, it only reinforced his sense that he was becoming something less than fully human, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. What did appearance matter when there was no one left to notice or care? What had pride accomplished when everything worth taking pride in had been stripped away? Still, some deeply ingrained sense of responsibility forced him to saddle his horse and ride toward the distant smoke. If nothing else, he owed it to his employees to ensure that strangers weren't planning to cause trouble during the vulnerable winter months ahead. The ranch might feel meaningless to him now, but it still provided livelihoods for good men who deserved better than to suffer because their boss had lost the will to protect what he'd built. The ride across familiar territory brought no comfort, only fresh reminders of shared experiences that would never be repeated. Every trail held memories of teaching his sons to ride, to track, to read the signs that meant the difference between prosperity and disaster in cattle country. Every landmark was associated with some lesson passed down from father to sons, knowledge that would die with him unless he found the strength to care about the future again. As he crested the ridge that overlooked the eastern valley, Samuel saw something that stopped him cold. The camp below wasn't a temporary arrangement of travelers passing through. It was something else entirely, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loss, healing, and the unexpected ways that life could surprise a man who'd given up on tomorrow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What Samuel saw in the valley below defied everything he thought he understood about the world beyond his ranch. The camp wasn't the temporary arrangement of travelers he'd expected, nor was it the crude settlement of claim jumpers he'd feared. Instead, it was something that spoke of desperation wrapped in dignity, a carefully organized community of tipis and lean-tos that housed what appeared to be survivors of some terrible catastrophe. Even from his elevated position on the ridge, Samuel could see that these weren't ordinary circumstances. Smoke rose from cooking fires tended by women in traditional native dress, but their movements carried the careful efficiency of people conserving resources that were running dangerously low. Children played between the shelters, but their games were quieter than they should have been, subdued in the way that spoke of recent trauma. Most telling were the men, too few of them, and those present bore themselves with the watchful tension of warriors, protecting something precious against overwhelming odds. Samuel's first instinct was to turn back, to pretend he'd never seen what lay in his valley, and return to the familiar misery of his empty house. The last thing he needed was to become entangled in someone else's tragedy when he could barely manage his own. But something about the scene below held him frozen in place, some recognition that refused to let him look away. As he studied the camp more carefully, details emerged that painted a picture of systematic displacement. These people hadn't chosen to settle in his remote valley, they'd been driven here by forces beyond their control. The tipis were patched and worn, suggesting a long journey under difficult conditions. Horses grazed nearby, but there were few of them, and those present showed signs of hard travel. Whatever had brought these people to his land, it hadn't been voluntary migration. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from behind startled Samuel from his observations. He turned to see Bill Crawford riding up the slope, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that came from years of reading dangerous situations. At 55, Crawford had worked for the Double Eagle longer than anyone, starting as a young cowhand when Samuel was still building the ranch from nothing. If anyone had earned the right to speak freely, it was Bill. "Boss," Crawford said, reining in beside Samuel and studying the camp below. "Thought you should know 3 of the boys spotted Indian sign yesterday near the north pasture. Fresh tracks, unshod ponies, heading this direction. Looks like we found where they were going." Samuel nodded, unsurprised. The tracks would belong to scouts from the camp below, men sent out to assess their surroundings and ensure their people's safety. It was exactly what he would have done in their situation. "How many?" he asked. "Hard to say from the tracks, but Johnson thinks maybe 40, 50 people total. Could be more." Crawford paused, choosing his words carefully. "Boss, I've seen camps like this before, back when I was younger. These folks aren't raiding parties or troublemakers. They're refugees." The word hung between them like smoke from the fires below. Refugees. Samuel had heard stories, of course, about the government's increasingly aggressive policies toward native tribes. The reservations were shrinking, resources were being cut, and military pressure was forcing proud peoples into increasingly desperate situations. What he was seeing below was likely the result of such policies. Families caught between the advance of American settlement and the rigid boundaries of federal Indian policy. "What do you think they want?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Crawford was quiet for a long moment, studying the organized desperation spread across the valley floor. "Same thing anybody wants when they're pushed to the edge," he said finally. "A place to survive the winter." The implications were staggering. Winter in the Colorado Territory was brutal under the best circumstances. For a displaced community, with inadequate supplies and shelter, it could mean death for the most vulnerable, the children and elderly who couldn't survive sustained exposure to cold and hunger. These people had found themselves on Samuel's land because it offered resources they desperately needed: water from the creek that ran through the valley, shelter from the worst winds, and game that might supplement whatever food they'd managed to carry with them. How long have they been there? Samuel asked. Best guess? 3, maybe 4 days. Long enough to get organized, not long enough to put down real roots. Crawford shifted in his saddle, his expression thoughtful. They're being careful, boss. No hunting on your land without permission. Fires kept small to avoid drawing attention. These aren't people looking to cause trouble. They're trying to stay invisible until they figure out their next move. Samuel appreciated the assessment. Crawford had spent years reading the signs that separated dangerous situations from manageable ones, and his judgment had saved the ranch from serious problems more than once. If he saw refugees rather than raiders, Samuel was inclined to trust that evaluation, but understanding the situation and knowing how to respond to it were entirely different challenges. Samuel's legal position was clear. These people were trespassing on his property, and he had every right to order them to move on. The practical reality was more complicated. Where could they go that wouldn't present the same problems? Winter was approaching fast, and the nearest reservation was hundreds of miles away across territory that would be impassable once snow began falling in earnest. More troubling was Samuel's growing awareness that he simply didn't care enough about property rights to force desperate people back into the wilderness. The man who'd built the Double Eagle from nothing would have acted decisively to protect his interests. But that man had died with his sons, leaving behind someone who couldn't summon the energy to care about abstract concepts like ownership when faced with flesh and blood suffering. What do you think we should do? Samuel asked, genuinely uncertain. Crawford gave him a long look, one that seemed to take in Samuel's deteriorated appearance and the hollow expression that had become his default state. Honestly, boss, I think we should go down there and talk to them. Find out what their story is, what they need, how long they're planning to stay. Information first, decision second. It was exactly the kind of practical wisdom that had made Crawford invaluable over the years. Samuel nodded slowly, recognizing the sense in the approach, even as something inside him recoiled from the prospect of human interaction. He'd become accustomed to solitude, to the predictable rhythms of grief and isolation. Engaging with other people's problems would require energy he wasn't sure he possessed, but as they began their descent toward the camp, Samuel found himself studying the scene below with a different kind of attention. The children playing between the shelters moved with the resilience that belonged uniquely to the young, their laughter carrying across the valley despite circumstances that would have crushed many adults. The women working around the cooking fires demonstrated the kind of competent efficiency that spoke of deep cultural knowledge about survival under difficult conditions. Even the men, tense as they were, showed the controlled alertness of people who'd learned to protect what mattered most. There was something familiar about their situation that Samuel couldn't quite identify, some echo of his own experience that made their plight resonate in unexpected ways. Then it struck him. These people were facing the loss of everything they'd built, just as he was. Their traditional ways of life were being systematically destroyed by forces beyond their control, leaving them to navigate a world that no longer had space for what they represented. They were mourning the death of a future they'd expected to live, grieving for children who would grow up in a reality completely different from the one that had shaped their parents. The parallel wasn't exact, but it was close enough to create an uncomfortable sense of recognition. Samuel's sons had died in service to a country that was simultaneously destroying the cultures represented in the camp below. The same government that had sent his boys to fight for national unity was pursuing policies that made refugees of entire peoples. There was an irony there that was almost too bitter to contemplate. As they drew closer to the camp, Samuel could see that their approach had been noted. Men emerged from various shelters, moving with casual efficiency to positions that would allow them to respond quickly to any threat. There was nothing overtly hostile about their movements, but Samuel recognized the careful preparation of people who'd learned that survival often depended on being ready for anything, one figure in particular caught his attention: an older man, whose bearing marked him as someone accustomed to authority. He stood apart from the others, not hiding behind cover, but not exposing himself unnecessarily either. His clothing mixed traditional elements with practical additions that spoke of someone who'd learned to navigate between worlds. Most notably, he wore his authority like a comfortable garment, the kind of natural leadership that came from years of making decisions that affected other people's lives. This, Samuel realized, was the leader he'd need to deal with, the man whose decisions had brought these people to the Double Eagle, whose judgment would determine how this encounter proceeded. Everything about his stance suggested someone who'd faced difficult conversations before and survived them through a combination of diplomacy and strength. Crawford must have reached the same conclusion because he gestured toward the older man. "That'll be their chief," he said quietly. "Looks like he's waiting for us to make the first move." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settling around him like a physical presence. What happened in the next few minutes would determine not just the immediate future of the people camped in his valley, but potentially his own path forward as well. For months, he'd existed in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of life without engaging with its realities. Now he was being forced back into the world of decisions and consequences, whether he wanted to be or not. As they rode into the camp, Samuel was struck by the controlled tension that permeated everything. Children continued playing, but their games moved them closer to their mothers. Women kept working at their various tasks, but their hands remained near tools that could serve as weapons if necessary. The men maintained relaxed postures that could transform into defensive positions in seconds. It was the behavior of people who'd learned to hope for the best while preparing for the worst. The chief, for Samuel had no doubt that's what he was, stepped forward as they approached, his movements deliberate and confident. Up close, Samuel could see that he was probably in his 50s, with silver threading through black hair that was braided in traditional fashion. His face bore the lines that came from years of outdoor living and difficult decisions, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who missed very little. "I am White Eagle," he said in clear English, his voice carrying the formal cadence of someone choosing his words carefully. "These are my people. We camp on your land with respect, not as enemies." The directness of the introduction surprised Samuel. He'd expected more elaborate diplomatic preliminaries, the careful dance of words that typically preceded important negotiations. Instead, White Eagle had cut straight to the essential facts: identity, relationship to the group, their current status, and their intentions. It was the approach of someone who understood that time was a luxury they might not possess. "Samuel Harrison," Samuel replied, dismounting from his horse to meet White Eagle on equal footing. "This is my foreman, Bill Crawford. It's my land you're camped on." White Eagle nodded, acknowledging the implicit challenge without retreating from it. "Yes, we know this. We also know winter comes soon, and my people need shelter. We take nothing that belongs to you. We hunt no game on your land. We ask only for time to rest before we decide where to go next." The honesty was unexpected and somehow refreshing. Samuel had anticipated justifications, explanations, perhaps attempts to claim some legal right to be there. Instead, White Eagle was simply stating facts. They needed shelter, winter was coming, they weren't taking anything, and they needed time to plan their next move. It was the approach of someone who understood that lies would only complicate an already difficult situation. "Where did you come from?" Samuel asked, genuinely curious now. White Eagle's expression darkened slightly. "Sand Creek Reservation. Government said we had enough land, enough food, enough everything. Government was wrong. Too many people, not enough of anything else. Sickness came, food ran out. Some of my people chose to stay and accept what the white officials gave them. Others chose to come with me and look for a better way. Samuel felt something twist in his chest at the mention of Sand Creek. Even isolated as he'd become, he'd heard stories about conditions on the reservations, about the gap between government promises and actual resources provided. These weren't people who'd left their homes on a whim. They'd been driven out by circumstances that made staying more dangerous than the uncertainties of the trail. The parallel to his own situation struck him again, more forcefully this time. White Eagle had been forced to choose between accepting an unacceptable situation and striking out into uncertainty, hoping to find something better. Samuel faced a similar choice in his own way. He could continue existing in the hollow shell of his former life, or he could find the courage to engage with the world again, despite the risks that engagement entailed. "How many people?" Samuel asked. 47, White Eagle replied immediately. 15 men, 19 women, 13 children, all peaceful, all tired, all hoping for a chance to survive until spring. The specificity of the count told Samuel several things. White Eagle knew exactly who he was responsible for, which suggested strong leadership and organization. The breakdown by demographics indicated that this wasn't a war party or even a traditional hunting expedition. There were too many women and children, too few fighting-age men. Most telling was the phrase, hoping for a chance to survive until spring. This wasn't a temporary inconvenience for these people. It was a life-or-death situation with winter approaching fast. Samuel found himself studying the faces around him, seeing in them echoes of struggles he understood, even if their specific circumstances were different. These people had lost the life they'd expected to live, just as he had. They were trying to figure out how to move forward when the future had become uncertain, just as he was. The difference was that they were facing their challenges together, as a community, while he'd been struggling alone with burdens that felt too heavy for one person to carry. For the first time in months, Samuel felt something stirring inside him that wasn't grief or anger or despair. It might have been recognition or sympathy, or simply the long-dormant response of someone who'd once known how to take care of people who needed help. Whatever it was, it felt like the first genuine emotion he'd experienced since Thomas's death, and that alone was enough to make him pay attention. The conversation with White Eagle was far from over, and Samuel sensed that decisions made in the next few minutes would ripple out in ways he couldn't predict. But for the first time since he'd lost his sons, he felt like he was dealing with something that mattered, something that required him to think beyond his own pain and consider what kind of man he wanted to be when faced with other people's suffering. The old Samuel Harrison had built an empire through decisive action and clear moral choices. Perhaps it was time to find out if any of that man still existed beneath the weight of grief and isolation that had defined his recent existence. The silence that followed. White Eagle's words stretched across the camp like a held breath. Samuel could feel dozens of eyes watching him, waiting to see what kind of man he would prove to be when faced with their desperate circumstances. Children peered around their mothers' skirts, their dark eyes wide with the careful attention that belonged to young ones, who'd learned that adult decisions could mean the difference between safety and danger. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities and consequences, legal obligations, and moral imperatives. The rational part of him, the part that had built a successful ranch through careful planning and sound judgment, recognized the risks of harboring refugees on his property. The territorial government was already nervous about Indian activity in the region, and providing shelter to people who'd left their assigned reservation could bring federal attention he didn't want or need. But standing there in the midst of White Eagle's carefully organized community, watching children who reminded him painfully of his own sons at young ages, Samuel found that rational calculation seemed less important than they once had. What was the point of protecting property and reputation when he had no one left to inherit either? What did federal disapproval matter to a man who'd already lost everything that gave his life meaning? "Tell me about Sand Creek," Samuel said finally, his voice carrying across the quiet camp. "Tell me what drove you to leave." White Eagle's expression grew heavy with memories that were clearly painful to revisit. He gestured toward a fallen log near one of the cooking fires, indicating they should sit for a conversation that wouldn't be brief or simple. As they settled onto makeshift seats, Samuel noticed that the camp's activities resumed their normal rhythm, but he could sense people listening, waiting to hear their leader explain the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. "The reservation was promised to be temporary," White Eagle began, his English careful but clear. "Government men said we would have good land, enough food, schools for our children, doctors when sickness came. They said if we came peacefully, if we followed their rules, we would be partners in building something better." The bitter edge that crept into White Eagle's voice told Samuel everything he needed to know about how those promises had worked out. He'd heard similar stories from other sources: well-intentioned policies undermined by inadequate funding, corrupt officials, and the simple impossibility of supporting large populations on land that couldn't sustain them. "What happened?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the general outline. "First winter, they gave us blankets full of smallpox," White Eagle continued, his voice steady despite the horror of what he was describing. "Said it was accident, but accidents happen too often when Indians are involved. Sickness killed many. Of our elders, many children. Those who survived grew weak, hungry. Government food came late, came spoiled, sometimes didn't come at all." Samuel felt his stomach tighten as the familiar pattern emerged. Promises made by officials in distant cities, implemented by local administrators who cared more about budgets than lives, resulting in suffering that could have been prevented with adequate resources and genuine commitment. It was the same bureaucratic callousness that had sent his sons to die in wars that accomplished little beyond filling graveyards. When we complained, when we asked for what was promised, they told us to be grateful for what we had. White Eagle's voice grew harder. They said Indians should learn to live like white men, forget old ways, become farmers and Christians and good citizens. But they gave us no tools for farming, no seeds that would grow in that hard ground, no training for new ways of living. The impossibility of the situation was staggering. People were being asked to abandon centuries of cultural knowledge and survival skills, then given inadequate tools to replace them with new approaches they'd never been taught. It was a formula for disaster, implemented by officials who seemed genuinely surprised when disaster inevitably resulted. "So you left," Samuel said, understanding the logic even if he couldn't imagine the courage it had required. "Some of us left," White Eagle corrected. "Others stayed, believing things would get better, or too afraid to risk the trail with winter coming. I took only those who chose to come, only those willing to face uncertainty rather than accept slow death." The parallel to his own situation struck Samuel with renewed force. White Eagle had been faced with an impossible choice: accept an unacceptable situation, or strike out into the unknown, hoping to find something better. The difference was that White Eagle had chosen action over resignation, hope over despair. He'd taken responsibility for people who depended on him and led them toward whatever possibility of survival he could create. Samuel studied the man sitting beside him, seeing strength that had been tested by loss, but not broken by it. White Eagle had experienced trauma and displacement, had watched his people suffer and die, had been forced to make impossible decisions with inadequate information. Yet he sat here speaking calmly about their circumstances, focused on practical solutions rather than dwelling on injustices that couldn't be undone. "Where will you go when winter ends?" Samuel asked. White Eagle was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the camp where his people were preparing their evening meal. "North, maybe, Canada. Heard there might be land there." "Officials who deal more fairly with Indians." "Or west, toward the mountains where government men don't want to follow." "Somewhere my people can hunt, can live according to old ways while learning new ones that help us survive." The uncertainty in his voice was heartbreaking. This wasn't a man with a clear plan, just someone trying to keep hope alive while facing overwhelming odds. He was making it up as he went along, adapting to circumstances that changed faster than anyone could predict, holding together a community through sheer force of will and the trust his people placed in his judgment. "How long can you survive here?" Samuel asked, the question carrying implications they both understood. Honestly, White Eagle met Samuel's eyes directly. "Maybe until first heavy snow, if we're careful with food, if no one gets sick, if soldiers don't come looking for us. After that. He shrugged, a gesture that conveyed acceptance of realities. Too harsh to speak aloud. Samuel felt something shift inside him, a recognition that went beyond sympathy to something approaching kinship. Here was a man facing the destruction of everything he'd worked to protect, yet still fighting to preserve. What could be saved? White Eagle hadn't given up when confronted with impossible circumstances. He'd adapted, improvised, kept moving forward even when the path ahead was uncertain. It was exactly the kind of leadership Samuel had once provided for his own family and employees, the willingness to make hard decisions and accept their consequences. Somewhere in the months since Thomas's death, he'd lost that capacity for decisive action, retreating into grief instead of finding ways to honor his son's memory through continued service to others. "What do you need to survive the winter?" Samuel asked, the question emerging before he'd consciously decided to ask it. White Eagle's eyes sharpened with sudden attention. This wasn't a casual inquiry. It was a practical question that suggested possibilities neither of them had spoken aloud. Shelter from the worst storms, enough food to keep children fed, medicine for those who fall sick, permission to hunt when our supplies run low. The list was simple but comprehensive, covering the basic requirements for keeping 47 people alive through a Colorado winter. It was also a list that Samuel could potentially provide if he chose to. He owned thousands of acres that could support hunting. His ranch buildings included structures that could be modified to provide shelter. His connections in town could secure medicines and additional supplies. The question wasn't whether he could help, it was whether he would and what the consequences might be. Crawford, who'd been listening to the conversation with the careful attention of someone who understood its implications, finally spoke up. "Boss," he said quietly, "winter's going to be hard on everybody this year. Heard from Johnson that the signs all point to heavy snow, cold temperatures lasting longer than usual. These folks aren't the only ones who'll be struggling to survive." The observation was tactfully made but clearly intended. Crawford was reminding Samuel that the decision to help or refuse wasn't just about the Indians camped in their valley. It was about what kind of community they wanted to be part of. Word would spread about whatever choice Samuel made, affecting his relationships with neighbors, employees, and townspeople who would judge him based on his actions in this moment. But Samuel found he didn't care much about community opinion anymore. The approval of people he rarely saw seemed less important than the immediate reality of children who might not survive winter without help. His sons had died serving abstract principles about duty and honor. Perhaps it was time to focus on concrete opportunities to preserve life rather than pursuing ideals that seemed to require constant sacrifice of the innocent. "I need to think about this," Samuel said finally, aware that his words carried weight for everyone listening. "This isn't a decision I can make quickly or lightly." White Eagle nodded, understanding. "We ask only for fair consideration. We know what we request is not small thing. We know there are risks for you, problems we might bring. But my people are not raiders or troublemakers. We want only chance to live until spring comes." The dignity in his response impressed Samuel. White Eagle wasn't begging or making elaborate promises he might not be able to keep. He was simply acknowledging the reality of what he was asking and trusting Samuel to make whatever decision his conscience demanded. It was the approach of someone who understood that respect had to be mutual to be meaningful. As Samuel prepared to leave the camp, promising to return with his decision within 2 days, he found himself looking at the refugees with different eyes. These weren't abstract problems or political complications. They were individuals facing circumstances that could easily have been his own if history had unfolded differently. The children playing around the fires could have been his grandsons, if his sons had lived to start families. The women working to stretch inadequate supplies into adequate meals could have been his daughters-in-law, if war hadn't claimed the men who would have married them. The ride back to the ranch house passed in thoughtful silence, with Crawford respecting Samuel's need to process what they'd experienced. But as they approached the familiar buildings that had once represented the height of Samuel's ambitions, he found himself seeing them differently as well. The barns and corrals, the bunkhouse and storage buildings, the ranch house itself, all of it designed to support a thriving community of people working together toward common goals. For months, those buildings had felt like monuments to dreams that had died with his sons. Tonight, they looked like resources that could serve purposes he'd never considered. The question was whether he had the courage to transform grief into action, to honor his losses by preventing others from experiencing the same kind of devastation. As he sat on his porch that evening, whiskey untouched on the table beside him, Samuel found himself thinking not about what he'd lost, but about what he might still be able to give. For the first time since Thomas's death, the future felt like something that might be worth planning for. The weight of decision pressed down on him, but it was a different kind of weight than the grief that had paralyzed him for months. This was the weight of responsibility, of opportunity, of the chance to discover whether a broken man could find healing through service to others who needed what he could provide. Tomorrow would bring consequences he couldn't predict, but tonight, Samuel Harrison felt something approaching hope stirring in the darkness where his heart used to be. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He spent the dark hours walking through his house, opening doors to rooms that had been closed since his sons' deaths, running his hands along furniture built to last generations. In Michael's room, he found sketches of horse breeding operations that would never be implemented. David's desk still held legal books he'd been studying before the war called him away. The twins had shared plans for expanding the ranch into new territories, their optimistic calculations still visible on pages yellowed by time. Each room told the story of interrupted dreams, of futures that had been cut short by forces beyond anyone's control. But for the first time since the telegrams had arrived, Samuel found himself thinking not just about what had been lost, but about what might still be possible. His sons had planned to use the ranch's success to build something larger, something that would benefit the entire community. Perhaps their dreams could be honored in ways he'd never considered. Don brought Crawford to the kitchen door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the practical wisdom that had guided the Double Eagle through countless challenges. "Figured you might want company for thinking," he said, settling into a chair across from Samuel at the kitchen table. "Sometimes talking through problems helps clarify them." Samuel accepted the coffee gratefully, realizing he hadn't eaten or drunk anything since returning from the camp the previous evening. His body was running on nervous energy and the weight of impending decision, but Crawford's presence provided an anchor to practical considerations that needed attention regardless of what choice he made. "Tell me what you really think," Samuel said, trusting Crawford's judgment more than his own emotional responses. "Not what you think I want to hear, but what you honestly believe would be best for everyone involved." Crawford was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the thoroughness it deserved. "Honestly, I think those people are going to die if someone doesn't help them. Winter's coming early this year. I can feel it in the air, see it in how the animals are behaving. They've got maybe 2 weeks before the first real snow, and they're not equipped for what's coming. The blunt assessment hit Samuel like a physical blow. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it stated plainly made the consequences of inaction impossible to ignore. What about the risks to us? Federal marshals, territorial officials, neighbors who might not approve? There'll be risks either way, Crawford replied pragmatically. Help them, and we might face questions from authorities who don't like Indians settling on private land. Don't help them, and we'll have to live with knowing we could have prevented. Defson chose not to. Which risk can you live with easier? The question cut straight to the heart of Samuel's dilemma. He'd built his life around protecting what he'd created, maintaining the security and prosperity that would provide for his family's future. Now that future had been destroyed by circumstances beyond his control, leaving him to decide what kind of man he wanted to be when faced with other people's desperate circumstances. There's something else, Crawford continued, his voice careful. Been thinking about this all night, and I keep coming back to something that might matter. You know how isolated we've all become since the boys didn't come home. Ranch. Hands talking about moving on, neighbors keeping their distance because they don't know what to say. Maybe having people around who need help might be good for all of us. The observation surprised Samuel with its insight. Crawford was suggesting that helping the refugees might serve the ranch's interests as well as their own. That isolation wasn't just Samuel's problem, but something affecting the entire operation. Men needed purpose beyond daily maintenance, something larger than themselves to work toward. The refugees represented exactly that kind of purpose. You think the hands would accept it? Samuel asked, recognizing that employee support would be crucial for any plan to succeed. Johnson's already been asking about them, Crawford admitted. Says he saw smoke from the camp and wondered if we were going to do anything. Martinez mentioned that his family came north from Mexico for similar reasons, looking for a place where they could work and raise children without fear. Most of the boys understand what it means to be far from home and hoping for a chance. The revelation that his employees were already thinking about the refugees changed Samuel's calculations significantly. He'd assumed that helping White Eagle's people would create problems with his workforce, but it seemed the opposite might be true. Men who'd chosen to work for the Double Eagle understood something about loyalty and taking care of people who needed help. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted their conversation. Crawford rose to answer it, returning with Martinez, the ranch's horse trainer, whose weathered face bore the serious expression of someone bringing important news. Senator Harrison, Martinez said, his accented English carrying unusual urgency. Riders coming from town. 4 men moving fast, heading this way. Look like officials' badges, government horses, the kind of men who bring problems. Samuel felt his stomach drop. Had word about the refugee camp already reached territorial authorities? Were they coming to investigate reports of unauthorized Indian settlement on private land? The timing couldn't be worse. Samuel hadn't even made his decision yet, and already the situation was becoming complicated by outside forces. How far out? Crawford asked, moving toward the window to scan the horizon. Maybe 20 minutes, half hour at most, Martinez replied. They stopped at the Henderson place first, probably asking questions about unusual activity in the area. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities and responses. If these were federal marshals or territorial officials, they would have authority to search his property and remove any unauthorized residents they found. White Eagle's people would be defenseless against such action, with no legal recourse and no place to retreat. The decision Samuel had been weighing carefully was about to be forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control. "Boss," Crawford said quietly, understanding the implications as clearly as Samuel did. "Whatever you're going to do, you need to decide now. Those riders will be here soon, and they'll want answers about whether you've seen any Indians in the area." The moment of choice had arrived sooner than Samuel expected, stripped of the careful consideration he'd hoped to give it. In a few minutes, he would have to look federal officials in the eye and either tell them about the camp in his valley or choose to protect people who had trusted him with their lives. There would be no middle ground, no way to avoid taking a stand that would define who he was and what he believed. Samuel rose from the table, feeling something shift inside him that had been dormant since his son's deaths. For months he'd existed in a state of passive grief, letting events happen around him without engaging in the choices that shaped outcomes. Now he was being forced back into the world of action and consequence, and he discovered that some part of him welcomed the return to meaningful decision-making. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying new authority, "ride to the valley as fast as you can. Tell White Eagle that federal officials are coming, and his people need to move deeper into the canyon where they can't be seen from the main trail. Tell him I'll handle the officials, but he needs to keep everyone quiet and out of sight until they're gone." Martinez nodded and headed for the door, but Samuel called him back. "And Martinez? Tell White Eagle that after the officials leave, we need to talk about winter arrangements. Tell him Samuel Harrison has made his decision." As Martinez rode toward the hidden camp, Samuel turned to Crawford with renewed energy. "We need to make this place look normal, no signs that we've been paying attention to anything beyond ranch business. When those officials arrive, we're just cattlemen going about our daily work." Crawford smiled for the first time in months, recognizing the return of the decisive leader who'd built the Double Eagle from nothing. "What do you want me to tell the hands?" "Tell them we're about to find out what kind of men they are," Samuel replied. "Tell them we've got neighbors who need help, and we're going to provide it regardless of what any government official thinks about our choices." The next 20 minutes passed in focused preparation. Samuel cleaned himself up and put on clothes that reflected his status as a successful rancher. Crawford organized the hands to look busy with normal ranch activities. By the time the 4 riders appeared on the horizon, the Double Eagle looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a prosperous cattle operation run by men who had nothing to hide. The officials proved to be a mixture of federal marshal, territorial administrator, and 2 local deputies whose uncomfortable expressions suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with their mission. The marshal, a thin man named Peterson with the bureaucratic arrogance that Samuel had learned to despise, wasted no time on pleasantries. "Mr. Harrison," Peterson began, dismounting from his government horse, "we're investigating reports of unauthorized Indian settlement in this area. Have you seen any evidence of tribal groups moving through your property?" Samuel met Peterson's gaze directly, feeling the weight of the choice he'd made settling around him like armor. "Gentlemen," he said with the courteous authority of someone accustomed to dealing with officials, "you're welcome to look around my property. As you can see, we're running cattle and preparing for winter. Haven't seen anything that doesn't belong here." It wasn't technically a lie, since he considered White Eagle's people to belong exactly where they were. But it was certainly a carefully crafted truth that avoided revealing information these men had no right to possess. Samuel discovered that protecting people who'd trusted him felt better than he'd expected, more like the man his sons would have been proud of than the broken figure he'd become in recent months. Peterson's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but he had no evidence to contradict Samuel's statement. After an hour of searching the main ranch buildings and questioning the hands, all of whom gave consistent accounts of normal ranch activities, the officials prepared to leave with obvious frustration. "Mr. Harrison," Peterson said as he remounted his horse, "if you do encounter any unauthorized Indians on your property, you're required by territorial law to report them immediately. Failure to do so could result in serious legal consequences." Samuel nodded politely, giving no indication that the threat carried any weight with him. "I understand the law, Marshal. I've been operating in this territory for 40 years without legal problems. I don't expect that to change." As the officials rode away, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced since his son's deaths. the satisfaction of taking action that aligned with his deepest values. He'd chosen to protect vulnerable people rather than comply with unjust authority, to honor his son's memory through service rather than retreat into isolation. For the first time in months, he felt like a man his boys would have recognized and respected. The decision was made, and there would be no going back. Samuel Harrison was committed now to seeing White Eagle's people through the winter, whatever the cost to himself or his ranch. The lonely rancher had found a purpose larger than his grief, and winter was about to become something entirely different from the season of despair he'd anticipated. The first snowfall arrived 3 days ahead of schedule, blanketing the Colorado Territory in a pristine white that transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. Samuel stood at his kitchen window, watching flakes the size of silver dollars drift past the glass, and felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension that he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since his son's deaths, he was responsible for lives beyond his own, and the weight of that responsibility felt like a return to purpose rather than an additional burden. White Eagle's people had moved swiftly after Samuel's warning about the federal officials. Within hours of Martinez's message, they'd relocated to a sheltered canyon on the far side of Samuel's property, a hidden valley that offered protection from both winter winds and unwanted attention. The new camp was invisible from any commonly traveled route, accessible only through paths known to Samuel and his most trusted hands, but invisibility came at a cost. The new location, while secure, lacked many of the resources that had made their previous camp sustainable. The creek that provided water was smaller and more distant. Natural shelter was limited, requiring additional construction to protect against the harsh weather that was already beginning. Most critically, the canyon's isolation made it impossible for the refugees to supplement their dwindling food supplies through hunting or gathering. Samuel had spent the past 72 hours orchestrating a delicate balancing act that required all the organizational skills he developed during 4 decades of ranch management. Supplies had to be moved to the hidden camp without creating obvious trails that might attract attention. His ranch hands needed to be brought into the operation without compromising the security that kept everyone safe. Most challenging, he had to establish systems that could sustain 47 additional people through a Colorado winter without drawing notice from neighbors, suppliers, or government officials who might be watching for signs of suspicious activity. Solution he'd developed was both elegant and risky. Under cover of normal ranch operations, his men had been quietly stockpiling supplies in remote line cabins scattered across his property. These cabins, originally built to shelter cowboys during roundups and winter range management, were being transformed into supply depots that could support the hidden community without creating obvious patterns of activity. Johnson, his most experienced tracker, had established a network of trails that connected the line cabins to the hidden canyon through routes that followed natural contours and avoided areas where tracks might be noticed. Martinez had organized a rotation system that allowed ranch hands to transport supplies while maintaining their normal work schedules. Crawford coordinated everything with the methodical precision of a military quartermaster, ensuring that nothing was forgotten and no detail overlooked. But the most delicate aspect of the operation involved the refugees themselves. White Eagle had proven to be exactly the kind of partner Samuel needed, a leader who understood both the possibilities and limitations of their situation. Together, they'd worked out protocols that maximized security while allowing the hidden community to contribute to their own survival. The refugees' skills, Samuel discovered, were perfectly suited to their circumstances. Cherokee women possessed traditional knowledge about food preservation, winter clothing construction, and medicine preparation that made their limited resources stretch further than anyone had thought possible. The men brought expertise in hunting, tracking, and construction techniques that complemented the ranch hands' abilities. Most importantly, they understood the necessity of invisibility and had organized their community to minimize any sign of their presence, Samuel's first extended visit to the hidden camp had been a revelation. What he'd expected to find was a desperate collection of people, barely surviving in makeshift shelters. What he actually discovered was a functioning community that had adapted to its circumstances with remarkable ingenuity and grace. White Eagle met him at the canyon entrance, leading him along a path that had been carefully constructed to appear natural while providing easy access for people carrying supplies. The camp itself was a masterpiece of concealment shelters built into natural formations, cooking fires designed to disperse smoke through rock chimneys that made it invisible from above, storage areas carved into hillsides and camouflaged so effectively that Samuel might have walked past them without noticing. "Your people have done remarkable work," Samuel told White Eagle as they toured the hidden settlement. "This looks like a permanent village rather than a temporary camp." White Eagle smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Samuel had seen from him. "My people are survivors," he said simply. "We have had to learn quickly how to make homes from whatever we find. But we could not have done this without your help, without the tools and materials your men have brought us." The collaboration between Samuel's ranch hands and White Eagle's people had exceeded everyone's expectations. Language barriers that had seemed insurmountable proved manageable when people were working toward common goals. Cultural differences that might have caused friction in other circumstances became opportunities for mutual learning and respect. Martinez, whose own family had immigrated from Mexico, had become an unofficial translator and cultural bridge. His Spanish, combined with the Cherokee words he was rapidly learning and the English that several refugees spoke, created a communication network that kept everyone informed and coordinated. More importantly, his natural diplomacy had helped establish the trust that made genuine cooperation possible. Johnson had been paired with a Cherokee hunter named Swift River, and their combined knowledge of the terrain had identified game trails and water sources that neither would have found alone. The Cherokee understanding of animal behavior complemented Johnson's experience with local conditions, creating hunting opportunities that provided fresh meat for both communities without depleting the area's wildlife. Even more surprising was the relationship that had developed between Crawford and an elderly Cherokee woman named Grandmother Willow, whose knowledge of traditional medicine had already proven invaluable. When one of Samuel's hands injured his back during supply transport, Grandmother Willow's herbal treatments had him back to full strength faster than any doctor in town could have managed. But it was the children who provided the most unexpected blessing. 5 Cherokee youngsters, ranging in age from 6 to 14, had begun spending time at the main ranch during daylight hours, officially helping with chores, but actually bringing life and energy to buildings that had been silent for too long. Little Fox, a 8-year-old girl with bright eyes and endless curiosity, had attached herself to Samuel with the determination of someone who understood lonely adults needed company. She chattered constantly in a mixture of Cherokee and English, asking questions about everything from cattle ranching to the photographs of Samuel's sons that decorated his house. Her presence filled rooms with laughter that Samuel had forgotten was possible. Standing Bear, the eldest of 14, reminded Samuel painfully of Thomas at the same age, eager to learn, quick to understand, blessed with the kind of natural leadership that marked future chiefs. He worked alongside the ranch hands with focused intensity, absorbing knowledge about cattle, horses, and land management with the hunger of someone who understood he was learning skills that might determine his people's future survival. The 3 middle children, Dancing Elk, Singing Bird, and Winter Wolf, had formed an inseparable group that moved through the ranch like a small whirlwind, finding ways to help with every task while maintaining the kind of playful energy that reminded the adults why they worked so hard to protect the future. Samuel found himself looking forward to their daily arrival with an anticipation that surprised him. For months, his house had felt like a mausoleum filled with memories of the dead. Now it buzzed with the energy of young lives that demanded attention to the present moment rather than dwelling on losses that couldn't be changed. The children's presence also served a practical purpose that White Eagle had anticipated. If any unexpected visitors arrived at the ranch, the sight of native children playing around the buildings would seem natural and innocent rather than suspicious. Their comfortable familiarity with the ranch hands and easy interaction with Samuel created the impression of long-standing relationships rather than recent arrangements. But the most profound change was in Samuel himself. The man who'd spent months talking to empty chairs and drinking alone on his porch was rediscovering what it meant to be needed by people who depended on his decisions and leadership. The weight of responsibility that had once felt crushing now provided structure and meaning to days that had been drifting without purpose. Winter was settling over the Colorado Territory with the relentless inevitability of natural forces beyond human control. Temperatures dropped steadily, snow accumulated in drifts that would soon make travel treacherous, and the shortened days created challenges that tested everyone's preparation and resolve. But Samuel felt more alive than he had since his son's deaths. He was using skills he'd thought he'd lost forever, making decisions that mattered to real people, building something that honored his boy's memory through service rather than grief. The ranch that had felt like a monument to failure was becoming the foundation for a community that transcended the boundaries traditional society had tried to impose. The evening conversations around his kitchen table now included voices speaking 3 different languages, sharing stories that bridged cultures and generations. Children who should have been strangers were treating his house like home, filling it with exactly the kind of energy his sons would have brought if they'd lived to start families of their own. As Samuel prepared for bed on that snowy evening, listening to the wind howl around the solid walls his sons had helped build, he felt something approaching peace for the first time in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more snow to clear, more supplies to transport, more decisions about how to sustain a hidden community through the darkest months of the year. But tonight, he was simply a man who'd found purpose in protecting people who needed what he could provide. The lonely rancher was learning that healing came not from forgetting loss, but from transforming grief into love that could shelter others from similar pain. Outside, the snow continued falling, but inside the ranch house, warmth and hope were growing stronger with each passing day. The blizzard that struck in late December tested everything Samuel and White Eagle had built together. For 3 days, snow fell with an intensity that transformed the Colorado landscape into an alien world where familiar landmarks disappeared under drifts that reached the eaves of buildings. The wind howled with a voice that seemed determined to strip away any illusion of human control over the natural world that Samuel had weathered countless storms during his 40 years in the territory. But this one carried a weight of responsibility that made every decision critical. 47 lives depended on the supply network he'd established, the shelters his people had helped construct, and the coordination between 2 communities that had learned to function as one. The margin for error was non-existent when failure meant death for children who'd begun calling him grandfather. The ranch house became a command center during those 3 days, with Crawford monitoring weather conditions while Samuel tracked supply levels and White Eagle coordinated reports from the hidden canyon. The kitchen table that had once seated only Samuel in lonely silence now hosted strategy sessions conducted in 3 languages, as men who'd been strangers months earlier worked together to ensure everyone's survival. "The children are asking for you," White Eagle reported on the storm's 2nd day, his English careful as he translated concerns from the hidden camp. "Little Fox especially. She wants to know if Grandfather Samuel is safe from the bad spirits in the wind." The term struck Samuel like a physical blow, not painful, but overwhelming in its unexpected tenderness. Grandfather Samuel. When had that happened? When had a Cherokee child who'd known him for barely a month begun thinking of him as family? The realization that he'd somehow become a grandfather figure to children who weren't his blood relations filled a space in his heart that had been empty since his son's deaths. "Tell her I'm safe," Samuel said, his voice rougher than usual. "Tell her that grandfathers are harder to hurt than the wind thinks, and that I'll come see all of them as soon as the storm passes." White Eagle's smile carried understanding that went beyond words. During their weeks of collaboration, the Cherokee leader had watched Samuel transform from a broken man into someone who'd rediscovered his capacity for love and protection. The change had been gradual but unmistakable, visible in the way Samuel's shoulders had straightened under the weight of renewed responsibility, the way his eyes had regained focus when people needed his leadership. The storm finally broke on. The fourth day, leaving behind a world sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes that would have been beautiful if they hadn't represented potentially deadly obstacles. Snow had drifted against buildings in ways that made normal travel impossible, and the temperature had dropped to levels that could kill exposed skin in minutes. But the hidden canyon had survived, and the people sheltering there had maintained their community spirit despite the challenges. Samuel's first trip to check on the refugees required snowshoes and a carefully planned route that avoided areas where drifts might conceal dangerous terrain. Martinez and Johnson accompanied him, carrying medical supplies and emergency rations in case the storm had created problems that reports hadn't revealed. The hidden camp showed the effects of the blizzard's fury, but it also demonstrated the resilience that came from careful preparation and community cooperation. Snow had been cleared from essential areas using tools Samuel's men had provided. Cooking fires had been maintained throughout the storm using techniques that conserve fuel while providing maximum warmth. And the children had been kept entertained with stories and games that preserved morale during the long, dark hours. Little Fox spotted Samuel before he'd even entered the main camp area. Her delighted shriek of "Grandfather Samuel" echoing off the canyon walls as she raced through snow that came up to her knees. She launched herself into his arms with the complete trust that belonged to childhood, chattering in rapid Cherokee mixed with English words as she told him everything that had happened during their separation. "The wind tried to steal our houses," she explained solemnly, her small hands gesturing dramatically. "But Standing Bear and the strong men held them down. And Grandmother Willow made medicine tea that kept the scary sounds away. But I was worried. The wind might take you too, because you live in the big house all alone." The observation about living alone struck Samuel more deeply than Little Fox could have intended. For months, he'd chosen isolation as a response to grief, surrounding himself with empty rooms and silence that matched his internal state. But this child, with the clarity that came from innocence, had identified the fundamental problem with that approach. Loneliness was dangerous in ways that went beyond physical survival. Standing There approached with the serious demeanor of someone who'd taken adult responsibilities seriously during the crisis. At 14, he'd proven himself repeatedly during the past month, translating between languages, helping coordinate supply transfers, and demonstrating the kind of natural leadership that reminded Samuel painfully of his own sons at similar ages. "Grandfather Samuel," Standing Bear said formally, using the title that had apparently been adopted by all the children. "I want to show you what we built during the storm. We used the ideas you taught us about making strong walls." The tour that followed revealed engineering solutions that impressed Samuel with their practicality and ingenuity. Using materials he'd provided and techniques that blended Cherokee traditional knowledge with ranch construction methods, the refugees had created improvements to their shelters that would serve them throughout the winter. Windbreaks had been positioned to redirect the worst weather around living areas. Storage systems had been expanded to protect supplies from moisture and cold, and insulation had been added using natural materials gathered before the storm. The most remarkable discovery was a workshop area where Standing Bear and the other older children had been learning skills that bridged their two cultures. Under the guidance of Cherokee adults and using tools provided by Samuel's ranch hands, they were creating items that served practical needs while preserving traditional artistic elements. Elk had carved arrow shafts using techniques his grandfather had taught him, but he'd fitted them with metal points crafted by Martinez using ranch blacksmithing equipment. Singing Bird had woven baskets in traditional patterns, but she'd incorporated modern materials that made them more durable for contemporary use. Winter Wolf had been learning leather working from both Cherokee masters and Samuel's cowboys, creating items that combined the best techniques from both traditions. "They're building bridges," White Eagle explained as Samuel examined the children's work. "Taking knowledge from their ancestors and adding wisdom from your people. These skills will help them survive in whatever world they face when they grow up." The observation carried weight that went beyond immediate practicality. These children were members of a generation that would need to navigate between worlds, preserving essential elements of their heritage while adapting to realities that demanded new approaches to survival and success. The skills they were learning at the Double Eagle might determine not just their individual futures, but the continuity of Cherokee culture itself. Samuel found himself studying each child with new attention, seeing them not just as refugees who needed protection, but as individuals whose development would ripple through generations yet unborn. Little Fox's curiosity and fearlessness would serve her well in a world that would demand courage from anyone seeking to transcend traditional limitations. Standing Bear's leadership abilities and cultural bridging skills were preparing him for roles that might reshape the relationship between Native and white communities. The middle children, Dancing Elk, Singing Bird, and Winter Wolf, were developing specializations that could provide economic opportunities while maintaining cultural connections. Their combination of traditional knowledge and modern techniques might enable them to succeed in mainstream American society without abandoning the values and practices that defined their identity. As Samuel prepared to return to the ranch house, Little Fox tugged at his coat with the determination of someone who had something important to communicate. "Grandfather Samuel," she said seriously, "will you teach me to write the talking marks like white children learn? I want to tell stories about my people, but I want white people to be able to read them too." The request hit Samuel with unexpected force. This child was asking him to help her acquire tools that could bridge cultural divides in ways that might transform how different peoples understood each other. She wanted to preserve Cherokee stories while making them accessible to wider audiences. Exactly the kind of cultural translation that could build understanding and respect between communities that had historically viewed each other with suspicion or hostility. "Yes," Samuel promised, making a commitment that would require him to become something he'd never expected to be, a teacher of children who weren't his biological descendants, but who'd somehow become his responsibility anyway. "We'll start as soon as the weather allows regular visits." The return trip to the ranch house passed in contemplative silence, with Samuel processing the realization that he'd somehow acquired not just the responsibility for protecting White Eagle's people, but an active role in shaping the future of 5 children, who would carry forward whatever lessons he chose to teach them. That evening, as he sat in his kitchen reviewing the day's experiences, Samuel found himself thinking not about what his sons would have accomplished if they'd lived, but about what these Cherokee children might achieve with the advantages his position could provide them. The ranch that had been built to support one family's legacy might serve an entirely different purpose, creating opportunities for young people who represented the future of cultural cooperation and mutual understanding. For the first time since his sons' deaths, Samuel began planning for a future that extended beyond his own lifetime. These children would need education, opportunities, and guidance that could prepare them for roles as leaders and bridge builders in a rapidly changing world. He had the resources to provide those advantages, and perhaps that was exactly what his sons would have wanted him to do with the prosperity they'd helped create. The lonely rancher was learning that family could be defined by choice and commitment rather than blood alone. As snow continued falling outside his warm house, Samuel Harrison began planning lessons that would transform 5 Cherokee children into the grandsons and granddaughter his heart had never expected to find. The letter arrived on a February morning, when the world outside still lay locked in winter's grip. But inside the ranch house, the warmth of unexpected family had transformed what had once been Samuel's tomb of memories into something alive with possibility. Crawford brought the official envelope from town, his weathered face carrying the kind of concern that came from recognizing government correspondence that never brought good news. "Territorial Administrator's Office," Crawford said, setting the letter on Samuel's kitchen table where little Fox had been practicing her English letters that morning. Her careful attempts to write Grandfather Samuel in perfectly formed script still covered the slate board beside his coffee cup. Came through the military mail service. That usually means they want something they think you can't refuse. Samuel opened the envelope with steady hands, though he felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the official language that began with courteous formality and would inevitably progress to demands backed by federal authority. The content proved to be exactly what he'd feared, a formal inquiry into reports of irregular activity on his property, coupled with a requirement that he report to the territorial office in Denver within 30 days for questioning about possible violations of federal Indian policy. "They know," Samuel said simply, handing the letter to Crawford. "Maybe not the details, but they know something's happening here that doesn't match their records of authorized Indian settlements." Crawford read the document with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to parse official language for hidden threats and unstated consequences. "Could be fishing expedition," he said after a long moment. "Maybe they've heard rumors, but don't have solid evidence. Still, this puts us in a difficult position. The understatement would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so serious." Samuel was being called to account for decisions that had saved 47 lives and created the closest thing to family he'd experienced since his sons' deaths. But the federal government saw only potential violation of policies designed to control Indian populations and maintain the Kofoki boundaries that separated white settlements from native communities. The kitchen door opened to admit Standing Bear, who'd taken to arriving early each morning to help with chores, before beginning the educational sessions that had become central to all 5 children's daily routines. Now 16 after a birthday celebrated with Cherokee ceremony and ranch-style festivities, he'd grown into the kind of young man who commanded respect through competence, rather than demanding it through bluster. "Grandfather Samuel, Standing Bear said, immediately sensing the tension in the room. "There is trouble?" Samuel hesitated, torn between his desire to protect the children from adult worries and his recognition that Standing Bear had earned the right to know about developments that would affect his people's future. The young man had proven himself repeatedly during the winter months, taking on responsibilities that would have challenged adults while maintaining the kind of steady leadership that held the hidden community together during difficult moments. "Government. Men want to ask questions about our arrangement," Samuel said finally, choosing honesty over protection. "Nothing immediate, but they're paying attention to things they weren't watching before." Standing Bear's expression grew serious as he processed the implications. At 16, he understood better than the younger children what government attention might mean for Cherokee people who'd left their assigned reservation. His parents had died during the conflicts that preceded White Eagle's decision to lead their group away from Sand Creek, and he'd seen firsthand what happened when federal policies collided with native survival needs. "What will you tell them?" Standing Bear asked, the question carrying weight that went beyond curiosity. Samuel found himself looking at this young man who'd become as dear to him as any son. seeing in Standing Bear's steady gaze the same qualities of courage and integrity that had characterized Michael, David, Joseph, Robert, and Thomas. The parallel wasn't exact. Standing Bear's challenges were different from those his biological sons had faced, but the fundamental character was unmistakably similar. "I'll tell them the truth," Samuel said simply. "That I've helped neighbors who needed assistance, that I've acted according to my conscience, and that I'll continue doing what I believe is right, regardless of what they think about my choices." The answer seemed to satisfy Standing Bear, whose slight smile suggested approval of the defiant stance. "Good," he said with the kind of calm confidence that reminded Samuel why this young man was destined for leadership. "My people have learned that government men respect strength more than compliance. If you show fear, they will push harder. If you show backbone, sometimes they find easier targets." The wisdom in the observation impressed Samuel, as did the casual way Standing Bear had claimed ownership of the situation by referring to "my people." Over the past months, the distinction between Cherokee refugees and ranch community had blurred until it became meaningless. Standing Bear thought of himself as part of the Double Eagle family, just as Samuel had come to consider the Cherokee children his grandchildren in every way that mattered. Little Fox's arrival interrupted their serious conversation with the kind of cheerful energy that transformed any room she entered. Now 9 years old and possessed of English skills that had progressed remarkably since their first meeting, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her right to belong wherever she chose to be. "Grandfather Samuel," she announced, settling beside him with the familiarity that came from months of shared breakfasts. "Today I want to learn about the talking papers that tell stories to people far away. Dancing Elk says white people send their thoughts through marks on paper to other white people in distant places." The request for letter writing instruction came at a moment when such skills might prove crucial for more than educational purposes. If Samuel was going to face government questioning, he would need to document everything carefully, create records that supported his version of events, and possibly prepare communications that could influence how officials interpreted his actions. "Letters," Samuel explained, retrieving paper and ink from the desk where he'd once conducted ranch business in solitude. "We call them letters when we send thoughts and information to people we can't talk to face to face. Would you like to learn how to write a letter that could reach someone 100 miles away?" Little Fox's eyes widened with the kind of wonder that made teaching her an absolute pleasure. "Could I send talking papers to Cherokee people on other reservations? Could I tell them about the good things that happen when different peoples work together?" The question revealed an ambition that went far beyond simple literacy. This child was envisioning herself as a communicator who could bridge cultural divides, sharing success stories that might encourage cooperation between communities that had historically viewed each other with suspicion. Her goals aligned perfectly with what Samuel had come to believe was the most important work he could do, proving that different peoples could thrive together when given the opportunity. The letter writing lesson that followed became an impromptu strategy session as Samuel realized that Little Fox's communication ambitions might serve purposes that extended beyond education. If Cherokee communities across the territory could learn about the successful partnership at the Double Eagle, they might become advocates for similar arrangements rather than viewing all white ranchers as potential threats. "What would you want to tell other Cherokee people about our life here?" Samuel asked as Little Fox practiced forming letters that spelled out her name in English script. "I would tell them that some white grandfathers have good hearts," she said seriously, concentrating on making each letter perfect. "I would tell them that learning white ways doesn't mean forgetting Cherokee ways. I would tell them that children can grow strong when they have many kinds of teachers." The profound wisdom in her words reminded Samuel why he'd grown to love this child so deeply. Little Fox understood instinctively what many adults struggled to grasp, that cultural exchange could strengthen rather than weaken identity. that learning from others didn't require abandoning one's own heritage, that children thrived when they had access to diverse sources of knowledge and wisdom. As the morning progressed, the other children arrived for their daily lessons, each bringing news from the hidden canyon and questions that reflected their growing understanding of the complex world they were learning to navigate. Dancing Elk had completed a hunting bow that combined Cherokee traditional design with improvements suggested by ranch techniques. Singing Bird had mastered a weaving pattern that created textiles suitable for sale in white markets, while maintaining authentic Cherokee artistic elements. Winter Wolf had developed a system for training horses that blended native approaches with methods he'd learned from Samuel's cowboys. Each achievement represented exactly the kind of cultural bridge building that Samuel believed could transform relationships between white and native communities. These children were proving that different traditions could be combined to create approaches that were stronger than either alone, that innovation could emerge from respectful exchange rather than cultural domination. But the letter from the territorial office cast a shadow over these achievements, reminding everyone that their success existed in defiance of policies that sought to prevent exactly the kind of cooperation they'd developed. Samuel would have to defend not just his own actions, but the validity of an approach to Indian relations that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial separation and cultural incompatibility. That evening, as Samuel sat with White Eagle, planning responses to potential government challenges, he realized that the hearing in Denver would be more than a legal proceeding. It would be a test of whether his vision of cultural cooperation could survive contact with official opposition. "Whatever they ask you," White Eagle advised, "remember that our children are the strongest argument for what we've accomplished. Standing Bear can lead men twice his age. Little Fox can read and write better than many white children. Dancing Elk, Singing Bird, and Winter Wolf have skills that make them valuable to any community. These are not the results of failed policies." Samuel nodded, understanding that his defense would need to focus on practical outcomes rather than abstract principles. The children who'd become his grandsons and granddaughter were living proof that cultural cooperation could produce exactly the kind of citizens that frontier communities needed: young people who combined traditional wisdom with modern skills, who could navigate between worlds while maintaining their integrity and identity. The test ahead would determine whether love and practical success could triumph over prejudice and bureaucratic inflexibility. Samuel had never felt more prepared for a fight that truly mattered. The journey to Denver took 3 days through February cold that bit through the warmest clothes and reminded Samuel why winter travel in the Colorado Territory required careful planning and considerable courage. He rode with Crawford and Martinez, both men insisting on accompanying him despite his protests that their presence might complicate an already delicate situation. Their loyalty touched him more deeply than he could express. These men who'd chosen to stand with him when doing so might cost them their livelihoods. Behind them, hidden in the canyon that had become home to 47 people whose lives hung in the balance, White Eagle maintained the careful routines that kept their community invisible and functioning. The children had begged to come, particularly Little Fox, who'd argued with heartbreaking logic that her presence might help government officials understand what their arrangement had accomplished. Samuel had refused, knowing that exposing the children to federal scrutiny could destroy the very futures he was fighting to protect. Denver in February was a city transformed by winter into something harsh and unforgiving, its streets filled with mud and slush that reflected the gray sky above. The territorial capital bustled with the kind of energy that came from men making decisions that affected thousands of lives, most of whom would never have a voice in the policies that determined their fates. Samuel had visited the city many times over the decades, conducting business that had built his ranch into one of the territory's most successful operations, but this time felt different. This time he came not as a prosperous cattleman seeking favorable policies, but as a man who might be judged a criminal for choosing compassion over compliance. The territorial offices occupied a stone building that had been designed to intimidate, as much as to house government functions. Its imposing facade spoke of federal authority backed by military power, of policies that would be enforced regardless of local preferences or individual circumstances. As Samuel climbed the steps to face whatever awaited him inside, he carried with him not just his own fate, but the future of 5 children who'd taught him that family could be chosen rather than inherited. Territorial Administrator Marcus Thornton proved to be exactly the kind of man Samuel had expected: middle-aged, well-dressed, possessed of the particular arrogance that came from wielding power over people who had no recourse against his decisions. His office reflected his status with expensive furniture and maps that showed the territory divided into neat administrative units, as if human relationships could be managed through bureaucratic precision. "Mr. Harrison," Thornton began without preamble, "you've been called here to answer questions about possible violations of federal Indian policy. Specifically, we've received reports that you may be harboring unauthorized Native Americans on your property, providing them with support that enables them to avoid compliance with reservation requirements." The formal language couldn't disguise the fundamental accusation that Samuel had chosen human decency over legal obligation, that he'd prioritized individual suffering over collective policy. Samuel met Thornton's gaze directly, drawing on the same inner strength that had sustained him through decades of building a ranch from wilderness and raising sons who'd grown into men he could be proud of. "I've provided assistance to neighbors who needed help," Samuel replied carefully. "I've acted according to my conscience and my understanding of Christian duty. If that constitutes violation of federal policy, then perhaps the policy needs examination rather than my actions." Thornton's eyes narrowed at the implicit challenge to federal authority. "Mr. Harrison, the reservation system exists for important reasons. It provides structure and support for Native populations while ensuring that settlement proceeds in an orderly fashion. When individuals like yourself undermine that system, you create chaos that threatens everyone's security." The response revealed exactly the kind of thinking that had created the crisis Samuel was fighting to address. Thornton saw government policy as inherently reasonable, viewing any deviation from official procedures as dangerous regardless of the circumstances that might have necessitated such deviation. He couldn't imagine that federal programs might be inadequate or that individual initiative might produce better outcomes than bureaucratic management. "Administrator Thornton," Samuel said, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that everything he said would be evaluated for evidence of criminal intent. "I've spent 40 years in this territory building relationships with people of many different backgrounds. My experience suggests that cooperation and mutual assistance produce better results than rigid adherence to policies that may not reflect local realities." The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental gap between Samuel's approach and official thinking. Thornton questioned him about specific individuals, seeking evidence that could be used to justify enforcement action against the hidden community. Samuel provided general responses that acknowledged helping people in need without giving details that could endanger anyone's safety. The most challenging moment came when Thornton produced a document that made Samuel's blood run cold. A detailed report from a federal investigator who'd been monitoring the Double Eagle Ranch for weeks, documenting patterns of activity that suggested ongoing support for a significant Native population. "This report indicates systematic supply transport to remote areas of your property," Thornton said, spreading maps marked with routes that Samuel recognized as the paths his men had used to support the hidden canyon. "It describes construction activity consistent with permanent settlement, and it documents the presence of Native children on your property during daylight hours." Samuel felt his carefully constructed defenses crumbling as he realized how thoroughly their operations had been observed and documented. The investigator had been competent and patient, building a case that would be difficult to deny or explain away through general statements about helping neighbors. The children he'd been trying to protect had been photographed and identified. Their presence at the ranch recorded as evidence of illegal activity rather than educational opportunity. "What do you want from me?" Samuel asked, abandoning pretense in favor of direct confrontation. "I want the location of the unauthorized settlement," Thornton replied immediately. "I want a complete list of individuals being harbored on your property. And I want your cooperation in returning these people to their assigned reservation, where they can receive the support and supervision that federal policy provides." The demand hit Samuel like a physical blow. Thornton was asking him to betray people who'd trusted him with their lives, to destroy a community that had become the closest thing to family he'd experienced since his son's deaths. The administrator saw only policy violation where Samuel had found healing and purpose, only illegal activity where a miracle of cooperation and mutual care had emerged from desperate circumstances. "And if I refuse?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll be charged with multiple violations of federal Indian policy, potentially including charges of conspiracy to violate territorial law," Thornton said with the satisfaction of someone who held overwhelming advantages. "Your property could be seized as evidence of criminal activity. Your associates could face similar charges. The native individuals you've been harboring will be returned to reservation control regardless of your cooperation, but your refusal will ensure they face additional consequences for their unauthorized departure." The threat was comprehensive and devastating. Thornton had the power to destroy everything Samuel had built, to punish everyone who'd been involved in their arrangement, and to ensure that the children who'd brought meaning back to his life would suffer for the crime of having been loved and protected by someone outside their racial community. But as Samuel processed the magnitude of what he was facing, he found himself thinking not about what he might lose, but about what those children had taught him about courage in the face of impossible odds. Standing Bear had shown him that leadership meant protecting others, even when the cost was personal sacrifice. Little Fox had demonstrated that hope could survive even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Dancing Elk, Singing Bird, and Winter. Vilf had proven that young people could adapt to any challenge when they had adults who believed in their potential. "I need time to consider your offer," Samuel said finally, using language that suggested negotiation while actually buying time to formulate a response that might protect the people he'd come to love. Thornton nodded, clearly believing he'd won the confrontation. 24 hours, Mr. Harrison. After that, federal marshals will be dispatched to your property with authority to conduct whatever searches are necessary to locate and remove unauthorized native populations." As Samuel left the territorial building, his mind raced through possibilities that all seemed to lead toward tragedy. He could comply with Thornton's demands, betraying his chosen family to save himself from criminal prosecution. He could refuse and face the destruction of everything he'd worked to build, along with severe consequences for people whose only crime had been trusting him to protect them. Or he could find a third option, something that honored both his obligations to the people he loved and his determination to resist policies that treated human beings as problems to be managed rather than individuals deserving respect and opportunity. The answer came to him as he walked through Denver's muddy streets, past buildings that housed the kind of power that had sent his sons to die in distant wars and now threatened to destroy the family he'd found in their absence. Samuel Harrison had spent his life building things that lasted, creating value that could withstand whatever challenges the future might bring. Perhaps it was time to build something that could survive even the full weight of federal authority, a defense so compelling that even administrators like Thornton would be forced to acknowledge that some accomplishments transcended the boundaries of bureaucratic thinking. The fight for his family was far from over, and Samuel was about to discover resources he'd never known he possessed. Samuel spent the night in Denver's finest hotel, but sleep eluded him as his mind raced through the strategy he'd conceived during his walk through the city's muddy streets. By dawn, he'd formulated a plan that was either brilliant or catastrophically naive, a gamble that would stake everything on the power of demonstrated success to overcome bureaucratic prejudice, instead of returning to Administrator Thornton's office alone with either submission or defiance. Samuel spent the morning visiting 3 of Denver's most influential citizens, men whose opinions carried weight that transcended political boundaries. Each conversation required careful diplomacy, as Samuel had to explain his situation without revealing details that could endanger the hidden community before his strategy had a chance to work. Judge William Morrison had presided over territorial courts for 15 years, building a reputation for fairness that made his support valuable to any cause. Samuel found him in his private study, surrounded by law books that chronicled the evolution of justice in frontier society. Morrison listened with the careful attention of someone accustomed to weighing complex evidence before reaching decisions that affected people's lives. "You're asking me to challenge federal Indian policy based on your personal experience with a small group," Morrison said after Samuel had presented his case. "That's a significant request, particularly when you're admitting to technical violations of territorial law. I'm asking you to consider whether justice is better served by rigid adherence to failed policies or by recognizing successful innovations that achieve better outcomes." Samuel replied, "The children I've helped educate are living proof that cooperation produces better results than separation." Morrison's weathered face reflected the internal struggle of a man whose legal training emphasized procedure while his experience had taught him that procedure sometimes failed to serve justice. "What exactly do you want from me?" "Your presence when I meet with Administrator Thornton this afternoon," Samuel said. "Your voice when he claims that my actions threaten territorial security. Your witness when I present evidence that federal policy is producing exactly the kind of problems it claims to prevent." The second visit took Samuel to Dr. Elizabeth Crenshaw, whose medical practice served Denver's diverse population without regard to racial or cultural boundaries. Samuel had known her professionally for years, respecting her commitment to treating anyone who needed care, regardless of their ability to pay or their social status. Dr. Crenshaw received him in her clinic, where the waiting room held a mixture of patients that reflected Denver's complex demographics: miners, merchants, farmers, immigrants, and Native Americans, who'd found in her someone willing to bridge the medical gap between traditional healing and modern techniques. "Samuel," she said, her direct manner unchanged by the years, "Crawford sent word ahead explaining some of your situation. You've been sheltering Cherokee refugees and providing them with medical care and education. Now the government wants to break up your arrangement and return them to reservation conditions that you believe are inadequate." "That's the essential facts," Samuel confirmed. "But there's more to it than simple charity. These people have become family to me, and their children have capabilities that could benefit the entire territory if they're given proper opportunities to develop them." Dr. Crenshaw nodded thoughtfully. "I've treated patients from the reservations. Malnutrition, diseases that come from overcrowding, injuries that result from inadequate shelter and equipment. The medical evidence supports your concerns about reservation conditions. Would you be willing to testify about that evidence?" Samuel asked, "Would you help demonstrate that federal policy is creating the health problems it claims to address?" The third conversation took place in the office of Father Miguel Santos, whose Catholic mission served both the Mexican immigrants who'd remained in Colorado after territorial acquisition and the Native Americans who sought spiritual guidance that respected their traditional beliefs while offering new forms of community support. Father Santos had built his reputation on the radical notion that Christianity could be practiced without abandoning cultural identity, that salvation could be achieved through addition rather than replacement of existing spiritual traditions. His mission housed classrooms where children learned English and Spanish in Cherokee, workshops where traditional crafts were taught alongside modern skills, and meeting spaces where different communities came together to address common challenges. "My friend," Father Santos said, his accented English warm with genuine affection, "you have discovered what I have always believed, that God's love works best when people help each other across the boundaries that society creates. Your Cherokee family is evidence of grace in action. But will that evidence be enough to convince government officials who see only policy violations?" Samuel asked. "Perhaps not alone," Father Santos admitted. "But combined with other voices, other examples of success, it might plant seeds that grow into better understanding. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that change minds, rather than policies." The strategy Samuel had developed required coordination that tested his organizational abilities and demanded trust from people who had little reason to believe his gamble would succeed. But by noon, he'd assembled a group whose combined influence might be sufficient to challenge Administrator Thornton's assumptions about the effectiveness of federal Indian policy. The return to the territorial office felt different with Judge Morrison, Dr. Crenshaw, and Father Santos accompanying him. What had been designed as an intimidation session became something closer to a hearing, with Thornton suddenly facing people whose opinions carried weight in Denver's political and social circles. "Administrator Thornton," Judge Morrison began. Before Thornton could take control of the meeting, "We're here to discuss concerns about the implementation of federal Indian policy in our territory. Specifically, we want to examine whether current approaches are achieving their stated objectives." Thornton's discomfort was visible as he realized that his simple enforcement action had somehow transformed into a policy review session. "Judge Morrison, with respect, we're here to address specific violations of federal law, not to debate policy effectiveness." "But the two issues are connected," Dr. Crenshaw interjected smoothly. "If current policies are producing the problems they claim to solve, then individual actions that achieve better outcomes shouldn't be treated as criminal violations." What followed was the most important conversation of Samuel's life, a 3-hour discussion that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of 5 children who'd become the center of his world. Samuel presented his case methodically, describing the conditions that had driven White Eagle's people from the Sand Creek Reservation, detailing the successful community they'd built on his ranch, and documenting the achievements of children who'd thrived under the educational opportunities he'd provided. Judge Morrison contributed legal analysis that questioned whether technical violations of policy should be prosecuted when they produced outcomes that aligned with policy objectives better than official programs did. Dr. Crenshaw provided medical testimony about reservation health conditions that supported Samuel's claims about the necessity of his intervention. Father Santos offered philosophical and practical arguments about the value of cultural cooperation that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial separation. The turning point came when Samuel produced letters, dozens of them, written by Little Fox to Cherokee communities across the territory, describing the successes they'd achieved through cooperation with white neighbors. The letters, composed in perfect English but filled with Cherokee cultural references, demonstrated exactly the kind of bridge building that federal policy claimed to encourage while actually preventing. "This child has learned to communicate across cultural boundaries while maintaining her identity," Samuel said, passing the letters around the room. "She's developed skills that make her valuable to any community while preserving knowledge that connects her to her heritage. This is what successful integration looks like, not the elimination of difference, but the creation of productive cooperation." Thornton read the letters with obvious surprise, his bureaucratic assumptions challenged by evidence of achievement that exceeded anything the reservation system had produced. "These are remarkable," he admitted reluctantly. "But individual success stories don't justify systematic violation of federal policy." "Maybe," Judge Morrison suggested carefully, individual success stories indicate that federal policy needs revision rather than rigid enforcement. The negotiation that followed tested everyone's capacity for creative problem-solving. Thornton needed to maintain federal authority while addressing evidence that current policies were counterproductive. Samuel needed to protect his chosen family while acknowledging technical violations of territorial law. The mediating influences needed to find solutions that served justice without creating precedents that would undermine legitimate government. Functions. The compromise they eventually reached reflected the complexity of frontier society, where practical solutions often required flexibility that challenged theoretical boundaries. White Eagle's people would be granted experimental status as participants in a new model of Indian education and integration, based at the Double Eagle Ranch under Samuel's supervision, but subject to regular monitoring by territorial officials. Arrangement satisfied no one completely, but it offered something everyone could accept. Thornton could report progress on innovative approaches to Indian relations. Samuel could continue protecting and educating his chosen family. White Eagle's people could remain together while their children received educational opportunities that might transform their future possibilities. Most importantly, the 5 children who taught Samuel that love could transcend racial boundaries would continue growing up in an environment that valued their heritage while preparing them for success in a rapidly changing world. As Samuel prepared to return to the ranch, he carried with him not just legal documents that protected his family, but proof that sometimes the most important victories were achieved not through force or compliance, but through the patient demonstration that better approaches were possible. The lonely rancher's journey from isolation to family, from grief to purpose, had become something larger, a bridge between worlds that might help others find their way toward cooperation and understanding. The children who'd given him reason to hope again were now positioned to carry that hope forward into a future that would need their unique combination of traditional wisdom and modern skills. The real test would come in the years ahead, as Standing Bear, Little Fox, Dancing Elk, Singing Bird, and Winter Wolf grew into the adults their grandfather's love had made possible. But tonight, as Samuel rode toward home through the Colorado wilderness, he knew that some bonds were strong enough to survive any challenge, and that family, like love itself, was something that could be chosen, built, and sustained through commitment that transcended the boundaries society tried to impose. The empty rooms of his ranch house would soon fill again with the laughter of children who taught him that healing came not from forgetting loss, but from opening his heart to new forms of love that honored the past while embracing the future. 5 years later, Samuel Harrison stood on the same porch where he'd once contemplated the unbearable weight of empty rooms and broken dreams. But the world around him had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible during those dark months after Thomas's death. The Double Eagle Ranch bustled with activity that reflected not the solitary ambitions of one man, but the collaborative efforts of a community that had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. Standing Bear, now 21, had become Samuel's official partner in ranch operations, his name appearing on legal documents as co-owner of an enterprise that had expanded far beyond cattle ranching. The young man who'd once been a refugee, seeking winter shelter, now managed operations that included the territory's most successful integrated school, a trading post that connected Cherokee artisans with Denver markets, and agricultural innovations that had attracted attention from as far away as Washington, D.C. Grandfather Samuel, Standing Bear said, approaching with the confident stride of someone who'd grown into leadership naturally. The territorial governor's delegation will arrive tomorrow for the inspection. Everything is prepared, but I wanted to review the presentation one more time. The inspection represented the culmination of 5 years of experimental programs that had transformed both federal, Indian policy and territorial approaches to cultural integration. What had begun as Samuel's desperate gamble to protect 5 children had evolved into a model that other territories were studying and implementing. The Double Eagle had become a proving ground for the radical notion that cooperation could achieve better results than separation. Little Fox, now 14 and possessed of an education that rivaled anything available in eastern cities, had become the unofficial ambassador for their community's success. Her letters, which had once been desperate attempts to maintain Cherokee connections, now reached government officials, newspaper editors, and policymakers who sought her insights into cultural bridge building. She moved effortlessly between worlds, equally comfortable in Cherokee ceremony and territorial legislative sessions. "The governor will want to see our school records," Little Fox said, settling beside Samuel with the comfortable familiarity that had characterized their relationship since her childhood. "I've prepared summaries showing graduation rates, employment outcomes, and college acceptances. The numbers speak for themselves." The numbers were indeed remarkable. Cherokee children who'd received education at the Double Eagle were graduating at rates that exceeded territorial averages, gaining admission to colleges across the country, and returning to their communities with skills that strengthened traditional culture while enabling engagement with modern economic opportunities. White children from neighboring ranches had begun attending the school, creating the kind of integrated educational environment that produced graduates who understood cooperation as natural rather than exceptional. Dancing Elk had become a master craftsman whose artistic work commanded premium prices in markets throughout the territory and beyond. His pieces combined traditional Cherokee designs with contemporary techniques, creating a fusion style that appealed to collectors while preserving cultural authenticity. More importantly, he'd established apprenticeship programs that taught other young Cherokee artists to develop similar skills, creating economic opportunities that supported entire families. Singing Bird had pursued medicine, studying under Dr. Crenshaw in Denver while maintaining connections to traditional Cherokee healing practices. Her combination of scientific training and cultural knowledge had made her invaluable to communities across the territory, as she could provide modern medical care while respecting the spiritual and cultural dimensions of healing that traditional approaches emphasized. Winter Wolf had become the territory's most sought-after horse trainer, developing techniques that blended Cherokee understanding of animal psychology with ranch management requirements. His methods produced horses that were not only well-trained but also content, animals that formed partnerships with their riders rather than simply submitting to human control. Ranchers throughout Colorado sought his services, creating demand that supported a growing business enterprise. But the most remarkable transformation had occurred in Samuel himself. The man who'd once sat alone at a table built for 7 had become the patriarch of an extended family that included not just the 5 Cherokee children who'd called him grandfather, but their spouses, their children, and the dozens of other refugees who'd found shelter and opportunity at the Double Eagle over the years. White Eagle, now in his 60s but still vigorous, had become Samuel's closest friend and advisor. Their evening conversations on the ranch house porch had become legendary among their community, sessions where Cherokee wisdom and frontier experience combined to address challenges that ranged from agricultural planning to international relations. The territorial government regularly consulted them about Indian affairs, recognizing that their practical success exceeded anything achieved through traditional policy approaches. The hidden canyon that had once sheltered desperate refugees had been transformed into a thriving community that included permanent buildings, workshops, classrooms, and ceremonial spaces. The Cherokee families who'd first arrived as refugees now owned property, operated businesses, and participated in territorial governance as full citizens whose cultural identity enhanced rather than threatened their American citizenship. "Tell me about the children," Samuel said, as he did every evening when the day's work was finished and the family gathered for the meal that had become their most treasured tradition. Little Fox smiled, understanding that this request had become Samuel's way of maintaining connection to the extended family that now numbered in the dozens. Thundercloud took his first steps yesterday, she reported, referring to Standing Bear's youngest son. Bright Star learned to write her name in both Cherokee and English. Running Fox caught 3 fish in the creek and insisted on cleaning them himself. The grandchildren Samuel's biological grandchildren through adoption and choice rather than blood represented the future he'd never dared hope for during those dark months of grief and isolation. These children grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable in Cherokee ceremonies and territorial social events. Natural bridge builders who would inherit a world where cooperation was normal rather than exceptional. The evening meal itself had become a symbol of everything they'd achieved together. The table that had once seated only Samuel in lonely silence now accommodated 20 people on ordinary nights, more during celebrations or when extended family visited from other communities. Conversations flowed in multiple languages. Stories were shared across generational and cultural boundaries, and decisions were made through consensus that reflected Cherokee traditions adapted to territorial realities. As Samuel looked around the table that evening, he saw faces that told the story of transformation through chosen love. Standing Bear discussed ranch business with the authority of someone who'd earned his position through competence and dedication. Little Fox shared news from her correspondence with educators across the country who sought to replicate their educational model. Dancing Elk, Singing Bird, and Winter Wolf described their latest projects with the enthusiasm of young adults who'd found purposes that honored their heritage while building toward their chosen futures. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was that of the newest additions to their family, 5 more Cherokee children whose parents had died during a cholera outbreak on the Kiowa Reservation. These youngsters, ranging in age from 4 to 12, had arrived 3 months earlier with the same desperate needs that had characterized the original refugees. They were learning the same lessons about love transcending racial boundaries, about family being chosen rather than inherited, about healing coming through service to others who needed what you could provide. The cycle was continuing, as Samuel had always hoped it would. The children who'd taught him about resilience and hope were now teaching the same lessons to a new generation of refugees who needed to believe that better futures were possible. The Double Eagle had become more than a ranch or even a community. It had evolved into a proving ground for the radical notion that love could overcome the divisions that society tried to impose. After dinner, as the family dispersed to evening activities that included homework and storytelling, crafts and music, Samuel found himself alone with White Eagle on the porch where so many important conversations had taken place over the years. Do you ever wonder what your sons would think of what you've built here? White Eagle asked, his question gentle but direct in the way that had characterized their friendship from the beginning. Samuel considered the question seriously, as he always did when White Eagle raised topics that cut to the heart of important matters. I think they'd be proud, he said finally. Not because I've honored their memory through grief, but because I've honored their values through action. They believed in duty and service, in protecting people who needed protection. Everything we've accomplished here reflects those principles. White Eagle nodded, satisfied with the answer. Your sons died serving their country's idea of honor. Your grandchildren will live serving a better understanding of what honor means, not conquest or dominance, but cooperation and mutual care. As the stars emerged in the clear Colorado sky, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought him from despair to hope, from isolation to community, from the unbearable weight of loss to the sustaining power of chosen love. The ranch that had once felt like a monument to failure had become a foundation for success that would ripple through generations. That tomorrow would bring new challenges, the governor's inspection, decisions about expanding their educational programs, discussions about extending their model to other territories. But tonight, Samuel Harrison was simply a grandfather surrounded by children who'd taught him that family was the strongest force in human experience, powerful enough to transcend any boundary that prejudice or policy might try to impose. Lonely Rancher had learned that healing came not from forgetting loss, but from transforming grief into love that could shelter others from similar pain. In saving 5 Cherokee children from winter and despair, he discovered that sometimes the most profound rescues were mutual, that in protecting others, he'd found protection for his own wounded heart, the empty rooms that had once echoed with. The silence of loss now rang with the laughter of children, who would carry forward the lessons of chosen love into a future bright with possibility. And in that laughter, Samuel could hear the approval of 5 sons who'd taught him about duty and service, whose memory lived on in every act of kindness their father showed to children who needed what he could provide. The Double Eagle Ranch had become more than a home. It had become a testament to the truth that love, like hope itself, could be chosen, built, and sustained through commitment that honored the past while embracing the future. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy any father could leave, proof that some bonds were strong enough to survive any loss, and that family, like love itself, was limited only by the boundaries of the human heart. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from U.S.